Well, welcome back to Whole Bible Study with Taddy Noy. I'm so thankful you're here today as we begin a brand new journey through the book of Exodus. If you've been with us through Genesis, you've seen the foundation of Israel's story: creation, covenant, family, struggle, and God's faithfulness through it all. The book of Genesis ends with Joseph's death and the family of Israel settled safely in Egypt. But today, as we open Exodus, we'll see how time, power, and politics begin to shift. If you're just joining in, don't worry. You stepped into a story that's already rich with meaning and is about to take a dramatic turn. Now let's read Exodus chapter 1 together. And so we're going to be reading Exodus chapter 1 in the NIV version. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then the new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal with them shrewdly, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter and with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Sifrah and Puah, "When you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth, on the delivery stool, if you see the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live." The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: "Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." Now for the deep dive, Exodus 1. Exodus opens not with a dramatic miracle or a divine speech, but with a list of names: the sons of Israel who went to Egypt. These names form a literary bridge between Genesis and Exodus, reminding us that this story did not begin in Egypt. It began in Canaan, and before that with Abraham in Mesopotamia. The continuity between the books is critical. Exodus is not a standalone tale. It is the next chapter in a story already underway. The Hebrew title for Exodus, Shemot, literally means names. It comes from verse 1. These are the names. This is a book about identity, who the Israelites are, where they come from, and how their identity will be forged under oppression and through deliverance. Verse 8 introduces a dramatic turning point. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. The Hebrew wording suggests not simply ignorance, but intentional disregard. The phrase lo yada means did not know, but in the biblical sense, knowledge often implies relationship, recognition, or covenantal awareness. This Pharaoh not only lacked historical memory, he rejected it. It's an ominous beginning. When rulers no longer honor the past, injustice often follows. This political amnesia serves as the backdrop for the enslavement of the Israelites. The once favored guests become a threat, and Pharaoh, sensing potential rebellion, preemptively oppresses them. Verse 10 is chilling in its realpolitik. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them. The word used for shrewdly, nikchakma, is from the root haka, meaning wisdom. But here it's a twisted wisdom, one of manipulation and control. Pharaoh weaponizes strategy for the sake of domination. And verses 7 and 12 form a thematic paradox. Even as Egypt oppresses Israel, the people grow stronger. Verse 7 uses 5 consecutive verbs to emphasize their multiplication. Were fruitful and increased greatly, multiplied and grew exceedingly strong. This echoes the creation mandate of Genesis 1:28, to be fruitful and multiply. In other words, God's creational blessing continues despite Egypt's oppression. Verse 12 reinforces this with irony. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. Oppression leads to growth. Egypt's strategy backfires. In Hebrew, this line is structured with poetic rhythm, emphasizing the futility of Pharaoh's policy. The idea of persecution leading to expansion becomes a biblical motif, seen later in the Christian texts as well, for example in Acts 8:1-4, where persecution scatters and multiplies the early church. This is no accident. The theological message is clear. God's purposes are not thwarted by human power. In fact, divine promises often advance through adversity. Egypt becomes the crucible in which the identity of Israel is forged, not in comfort, but in crisis. Now for some historical context. Pharaoh's fear of foreigners. Why did Pharaoh fear Israel? Historically, Egypt had been invaded by the Hyksos, a Semitic people who briefly ruled northern Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, somewhere around 1650 to 1550 BCE. Though later expelled, their legacy left deep cultural scars. Some scholars argue that Pharaoh's fear of the Israelites joining with our enemies in verse 10 reflects lingering paranoia about foreign influence. The Israelites, being Semitic like the Hyksos, may have been lumped into this broader xenophobia. Thus, Pharaoh's edict is rooted not just in racism or power politics, it may reflect an enduring trauma within Egypt's collective memory. Fear of invasion morphs into Semitic oppression. This aligns with modern sociological patterns. Groups perceived as outsiders often bear the brunt of national insecurity. The Bible subtly critiques this dynamic through Pharaoh's descent into cruelty. Now, forced labor and the cities of Pithom and Ramses. In verses 11-14, introduce slavery explicitly. The Israelites are forced to build store cities, Pithom and Ramses. These were like supply depots for military centers, used to consolidate Pharaoh's power. While some scholars debate their exact locations, the name Ramses suggests association with the 19th century dynasty Pharaoh Ramses II, somewhere around 1279 to 1213 BCE. This raises historical questions. Did the Exodus occur under this Pharaoh? Was the narrative written retrospectively using similar names? Regardless of the dating, the theological emphasis is that oppression intensifies. Note the repetition in verses 13 and 14. Ruthlessly, harsh labor, bitter. The Hebrew word for ruthlessly, perek, implies crushing exploitation. It's used rarely in the Bible, but always in the context of dehumanization, such as Leviticus 25:43. What we're witnessing is not just labor, it's a system of dehumanization. Egypt transforms the Israelites from guests to beasts of burden. This sets the stage for God's dramatic intervention later. Now, resistance, the midwives' courage. Verse 15 shifts the scene, introducing two heroines of the faith, Pārâ and Pārâ. These Hebrew midwives defy Pharaoh's genocidal decree. Their story is brief, but the impact is enormous. In a world dominated by male power, these women resist silently, cunningly, and faithfully. When commanded to kill male infants, they refuse, not with open rebellion, but with strategic subversion. Their explanation that the Hebrew women are too vigorous are required to require midwives may have been a partial truth or a clever lie. Either way, the Bible affirms their action. Verse 17 says plainly, the midwives feared God. In biblical thought, fear of God often denotes moral clarity and courage. These women recognized a higher authority than Pharaoh. In doing so, they become the first recorded civil disobedience in Scripture. Their story anticipates others, Daniel, Esther, Peter, and even Jesus, who challenged unjust power with holy resistance. As a result, God honors them. Verse 21, he says, he gave them families of their own. Some interpret this as literal offspring. Others see it as metaphorical. A house, a legacy, a name in history. Either way, God blesses those who stand for life. Now, Pharaoh's next move is more horrifying. Verse 22, every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile. This edict is no longer limited to midwives. It becomes a national policy. The state itself is now enlisted in genocide. The irony is bitter. The Nile, Egypt's life source, becomes an instrument of death. Now, historically, infanticide was practiced in various ancient cultures, often for reasons of population control or eugenics. What's unique here is that the explicit racial targeting, this is not just murder, it's ethnic cleansing. Pharaoh is trying to eliminate Israel's future by destroying its sons. But here's where the biblical story plants seeds of hope. What Pharaoh means for evil, God will use for deliverance. In chapter 2, the very river intended to kill Hebrew boys will become the path to salvation. For it is into the Nile that the baby Moses will be placed, and from the Nile he will be drawn. Now for some creation and recreation, this theological arc. There's a larger theological arc unfolding beneath the surface. The language of Exodus 1 deliberately echoes Genesis. Be fruitful and multiply, Genesis 28, and Exodus 1:7 and there's names listed, Genesis 46 and Exodus 1-5. It says the same. Oppression from a serpent-like power, Egypt, reminiscent of the chaos in Genesis 3. In many ways, Egypt becomes a new chaos, a dark womb of suffering. But out of that chaos, God is about to bring forth something new, a nation, a covenant, a liberation. Exodus is Genesis in reverse. Where Genesis tells how creation came into being, Exodus shows how the people are reborn. In Jewish tradition, the Exodus is referred to as the birth of Israel, and Exodus 1 is the labor pain. The water that brings threat, the Nile, will soon part for deliverance. The Pharaoh who rises to destroy will be overthrown. But first, we must sit in this tension. Now the Hebrew word, that's for some Hebrew word study. Hebrews and identity. The term used for the Israelites here is Ibirim, usually translated Hebrews. This term is often used by outsiders in the Bible. Its root, avar, means to cross over or to pass through. It suggests foreignness, mobility, and liminality. In other words, to be Hebrew is to be a passer through, a sojourner, someone not fully settled. It's a term loaded with socio-political meaning. The Hebrews are not just a people group. They are symbolic of a displaced, marginalized, and misunderstood community. This theme of sojourning will become central to Israel's identity. They are not meant to be comfortable in Egypt. They are pilgrims, not settlers, strangers in a land not their own. It's a pattern that reoccurs through Scripture. Abraham, Moses, Ruth, Daniel, even Jesus and Paul. Now for some literary structure from genealogy to genocide. Exodus 1 is structured to move from life to death, and then to a glimmer of resistance. In verses 1 through 7 is the blessing of life, multiplication. Verses 8 through 14 is the fear of slavery and oppression. And verses 15 through 21, resistance, courage, divine reward. Verses 22, genocide. But this structure also mirrors biblical hope. The pattern of descent into suffering, followed by ascent into salvation, is deeply embedded in Israel's theology and will find its ultimate expression in the death and resurrection of Jesus. Now for some final thoughts. Exodus 1 begins with names and ends with nameless children thrown into the Nile. It's a stark contrast and an intentional one. The Bible invites us to notice what happens when names are forgotten and people are reduced to threats. The heroes of this chapter are not warriors, not prophets, not kings, but midwives, women who protect life at great risk to themselves. We are reminded that God is already at work, even in the darkest beginnings. Exodus doesn't start with miracles, but with the ordinary people doing faithful things in dangerous times. Now as I read Exodus 1, I am struck by how the entire story of redemption begins in shadows. It doesn't start with fireworks. It starts with pain, silence, and a slow, oppressive tightening of power around God's people. But right there in the darkness, God is already sowing the seeds of liberation. Through two brave midwives, through the cries of the oppressed, through a Pharaoh who thought he held the power but had no idea what God was about to do. Sometimes life feels like Exodus, heavy, unjust, stuck in a story where the bad guys seem to win. But this chapter reminds me, God never forgets the names. Even when the world erases identity, crushes dignity, or tries to silence hope, God is already preparing a way forward. If anything from this chapter stood out to you, especially something I didn't cover, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment, share your insights, and let's keep the growing together. Thank you for studying this with me today, and tomorrow we'll see you in the next chapter of Exodus.